In the winter of 1917, the Russian Empire stood on the edge of collapse. Soldiers refused to fight, factories fell silent, and hungry crowds filled the streets of Petrograd. The mighty Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for over 300 years, faced a storm it could no longer contain. What began as protests for bread would soon ignite a revolution that toppled a czar and changed the course of world history forever. This is the story of the February Revolution, a moment of chaos, courage, and destiny that shaped the future of Russia. In 1905, the Russian Empire faced a humiliation unlike any it had ever known. For centuries, European powers had dominated the world, yet in the Russo-Japanese War, Russia, the mighty empire of the Tsars, was crushed by an Asian nation rising fast on the global stage. The Japanese victory at sea and on land shattered the illusion of Russian strength. The world was stunned, a European great power defeated by the East for the very first time. But the blow was felt most deeply inside Russia itself. Over 80,000 Russian soldiers had fallen and countless more wounded. Families mourned, industries buckled, and whispers of discontent spread from the factories to the farmlands. How could the Tsar, the father of the nation, allow such disaster? The myth of imperial invincibility had been broken. This defeat ignited flames of unrest. Protests erupted, strikes paralyzed cities, and peasants demanded change. The revolution of 1905 shook the throne of Nicholas II. Though the Tsar managed to cling to power, his authority was forever scarred. The empire that once stood tall was now weakened, divided, and mistrusted by its own people. The stage was set. Russia's first cracks had appeared, and they would only grow deeper. The spark that would drag Russia into the First World War came nearly a decade later. In June 1914, a single gunshot in Sarajevo echoed across Europe. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was dead, assassinated by a Bosnian Serb nationalist. Vienna pointed the finger at Serbia and issued a brutal ultimatum. But Serbia was no ordinary state in Russia's eyes. For centuries, the Russian Empire had styled itself as the protector of Slavic peoples and Orthodox Christians in the Balkans. Letting Austria crush Serbia would mean surrendering Russian influence and betraying the very idea of pan-Slavic unity. Nicholas II and his ministers knew the risks. The empire was still scarred from the Russo-Japanese defeat and internal unrest. Yet when Austria declared war on Serbia, Russia answered the call. Mobilization orders were sent out across the vast empire, trains packed with soldiers began to move west, and the world braced for something far greater than a Balkan dispute. Allies and enemies quickly chose sides. France, bound by treaty, stood with Russia. Germany pledged its loyalty to Austria-Hungary. Britain would soon follow. What began as a regional conflict was about to explode into the greatest war mankind had ever seen, and Russia, weakened yet defiant, marched straight into it. When Russia marched into war in 1914, it carried one undeniable advantage: sheer numbers. Millions of men could be summoned to the front, a tidal wave of manpower, unlike anything in Europe. But numbers alone would not win a modern war. Beneath the surface, the empire was unprepared. Its vast size, once a strength, now became a curse. Railroads were few and poorly built, unable to carry soldiers and supplies fast enough across endless distances. Ammunition was scarce. In some regiments, men marched into battle without rifles, forced to wait for a comrade to fall before taking up his weapon. The army itself was trapped in the past. Strategies were outdated, leadership rigid and slow. Generals clung to 19th century tactics while facing German artillery, machine guns, and modern coordination. Training was rushed, discipline uneven, and morale fragile. For the common soldier, the war was not glory, but misery. Endless marches, thin rations, and a growing sense of abandonment. They were lions led by blind shepherds, thrown into battles they could not hope to win. Russia may have entered the war with pride and purpose, but the cracks in its military machine were already widening, cracks that soon would split open under fire. At the outbreak of the war, Russia struck quickly, sending 2 armies into East Prussia. At first, Hope surged. Victories seemed possible, even inevitable, as the Russian steamroller advanced deep into enemy territory. But that hope would not last. In August 1914, near the town of Tannenberg, the German army encircled and annihilated Russia's Second Army. Over 100,000 Russian soldiers were taken prisoner in a single blow. Weeks later, at the Masurian Lakes, Russia suffered yet another crushing defeat, driven out of East Prussia for good. The dream of a swift triumph had turned to ash. Yet while Germany humiliated Russia in the north, the fight against Austria-Hungary in Galicia told a different story. Here, Russian armies surged forward, capturing vast swaths of land and seizing Lemberg. Tens of thousands of Austrian prisoners, many of them Slavic conscripts, fell into Russian hands. For a moment, Russia could claim the role of liberator, freeing fellow Slavs from Habsburg rule. But the victories in Galicia could not erase the disasters in East Prussia. The empire had bled heavily, losing men and morale at a staggering rate. The Eastern Front was settling into a brutal, grinding stalemate, one that would test Russia to its very core. As Russia struggled in the West, a new enemy emerged from the south. In late 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered the war, bombarding Russian ports along the Black Sea. For the Russians, this was no ordinary opponent. The Ottomans were their historic rival, a foe they had battled for centuries over the fate of the Balkans, the Caucasus, and Constantinople itself. The fighting quickly spilled into the frozen mountains of the Caucasus. Here, amid snow and treacherous terrain, Russia found an opportunity to strike. In January 1915, at the Battle of Sarikamish, the Ottoman army was lured into the bitter cold, ill-prepared and poorly supplied. Entire divisions froze or starved before they could even reach the fight. When the Russians counterattacked, the Ottoman lines collapsed. It was a catastrophic defeat. Tens of thousands lay dead in the snow, but the victory came with a darker shadow. In the wake of their humiliation, Ottoman leaders turned their fury inward. They accused the Armenians of siding with Russia and unleashed a campaign of mass deportations and massacres. What began as war would spiral into one of history's great atrocities, the Armenian genocide. For Russia, the war in the Caucasus brought triumph on the battlefield, but also a grim glimpse of the horrors yet to come. By 1915, Russia's early momentum had collapsed. In May, the Central Powers struck back with a ferocity the Russian army could not withstand. The Germans and Austro-Hungarians launched the Gorlice-Tarnów offensive, unleashing heavy artillery and well-coordinated infantry assaults. Russian lines buckled. Within weeks, entire armies were shattered, and the front began to unravel. The retreat that followed became known as the Great Retreat. Over 100,000 square kilometers of territory were abandoned, towns, villages, and fortresses left behind as Russian soldiers marched eastward. Warsaw fell. Lemberg was lost. The empire's people watched in despair as their army, once hailed as Europe's largest, seemed powerless to halt the enemy advance. The cost was staggering. Supplies had run so low that in some units, 1 in 3 men carried no rifle. Soldiers waited under German fire for comrades to fall, then picked up their weapons to continue fighting. Ammunition was rationed, boots wore through, and morale sank to the breaking point. In desperation, Tsar Nicholas II made a fateful choice. He assumed direct command of the Russian army, tying his throne to the fate of a crumbling war effort. It was a gamble that would haunt both him and his empire. Amid the disasters of 1915, one battle carved itself into legend: the defense of the fortress of Osowiec. For months, German forces had surrounded the Russian stronghold, bombarding it with artillery and choking the air with poison gas. The defenders, lacking gas masks, were doomed, or so the Germans thought. On August 6th, waves of chlorine gas rolled over the fortress. Russian soldiers collapsed, coughing blood, their lungs burned raw. The ground was littered with bodies. Convinced the fight was over, German troops advanced to claim their prize. But then, through the green haze, the impossible happened. Out of the smoke staggered the survivors, skin blistered, faces wrapped in rags, spitting blood with every step. They looked less like men and more like corpses risen from the grave. With bayonets fixed, they charged. The sight was too much even for hardened German veterans. Terrified by what they called the dead men, they broke ranks and fled. Against all odds, the fortress held, for a time. Though Osowicz would eventually be abandoned, its defenders had left a story of unimaginable courage. The attack of the dead men became a symbol of Russia's will to fight, even when death itself seemed certain. While the armies bled at the front, Russia itself began to crumble from within. The war strained the empire's fragile economy to the breaking point. Inflation soared, bread grew scarce, and long lines of hungry civilians filled the streets of Petrograd and Moscow. Factories ground to a halt as strikes spread, while farmers, exhausted and resentful, withheld grain from the cities. Discontent was everywhere, and, at the heart of it all, the monarchy's reputation sank lower each day. The presence of one man in particular fanned the flames, Grigory Rasputin, the mystic healer. To the Tsar and Tsarina, he was a savior, a man who could ease the suffering of their hemophiliac son. To the Russian elite and ordinary people alike, he was a charlatan, a symbol of corruption and decay at the very center of power. As defeats piled up at the front, rumors of Rasputin's influence over the royal family spread like wildfire. Many believed he whispered commands into the Tsarina's ear, steering Russia toward ruin. By 1916, his presence had become intolerable. In a dramatic act, a group of nobles lured him to a palace, poisoned, shot, and drowned him. But the damage was done. The Tsar's court was discredited, the people's trust shattered, and the empire slid further into chaos. In the summer of 1916, with Russia's allies begging for relief, General Alexei Brusilov unveiled a daring plan. Unlike the costly human wave attacks that had bled the Russian army dry, Brusilov proposed something new: precision. Small, specialized units would pierce weak points in the Austro-Hungarian lines, opening gaps for the larger army to flood through. On June 4th, the assault began. A thunderous artillery barrage shattered enemy trenches, and then silence. From the smoke, Russian troops surged forward, striking exactly where the enemy least expected. Within days, Austro-Hungarian defenses collapsed. Entire armies crumbled. In just 4 days, one Austrian army lost nearly 70% of its men. Tens of thousands were taken prisoner, and the empire itself teetered on the brink of collapse. For Russia, it was a moment of triumph. The Brusilov offensive was the most successful operation the Tsar's armies would ever achieve in the war. It forced Germany to rush reinforcements east, relieving pressure on the French at Verdun. It even convinced Romania to join the Allies. But victory came at a terrible price. More than 500,000 Russian casualties stained the fields of Galicia. For every step forward, the empire bled. Even in triumph, Russia was dying. By 1917, Russia was breaking apart. The Brusilov offensive had shown flashes of brilliance, but the cost was unbearable. Millions dead, an economy in ruins, and cities starving. Soldiers deserted in droves, refusing to fight in a war they no longer believed in. In February, the anger boiled over. Protests for bread in Petrograd swelled into mass strikes and mutiny. Soldiers sent to crush the crowds instead joined them. Within days, Tsar Nicholas II, the little father of Russia, was forced to abdicate. Centuries of Romanov rule ended in a single stroke. A provisional government rose in his place, promising democracy and reform. But it made one fatal mistake. It kept Russia in the war. When the provisional government launched the Kerensky offensive in the summer, the exhausted army simply melted away. Discipline collapsed. Officers were ignored or even attacked. Into this chaos stepped the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. With slogans of peace, land, and bread, they promised an end to war and suffering. In October 1917, they seized power in Petrograd, toppling the government. Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, surrendering vast lands to Germany. The empire had escaped the World War, but plunged headfirst into a brutal civil war that would reshape the 20th century. The February Revolution ended the rule of the Tsars. But it did not end Russia's turmoil. The provisional government promised freedom, yet it struggled to control a nation collapsing under war and hunger. Meanwhile, the Soviets grew stronger, and voices calling for radical change grew louder with every passing day. The fall of Nicholas II was only the beginning. Within months, Russia would face another far greater storm, the October Revolution, that would transform not only the fate of Russia, but the entire world. The question was no longer whether change would come, but how far it would go.